Hello. Woo. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Come on, I need a little feedback. Good morning. All right, that's the way we got to get started. My name is Congresswoman Karen Bass, and I want to welcome everyone to the sixth installment of our Africa Policy Breakfast series for 2015. This series will examine the ongoing African refugee crisis across the Mediterranean Sea. Before I go any further on the importance of this morning's subject matter, I'd like to thank and acknowledge each of the panelists that are here with us today. Kathleen Newman, co-founder of the Migration Policy Institute, who will be our moderator for the morning. The Assistant Secretary of State, Ann Richards, of the State Department's Bureau for Population, Refugees, and Migration. And Tahiti Farah, President and CEO of the Ethiopian Community Development Council. And I also want to acknowledge the representatives of the African Diplomatic Corps who are with us today and will be joining us as the morning goes on. From January 2014 to July 2015, more than 350,000 refugees and migrants have attempted to cross the Mediterranean Sea, seeking refuge and asylum across southern Europe. Nearly a quarter of that total originates in refugee-producing nations in sub-Saharan Africa, including Eritrea, the Gambia, Nigeria, Somalia, and Sudan. This year alone, we have seen several tragic reports of African refugees and migrants drowning at sea in attempts to transit from North Africa to southern Europe. The largest and deadliest of these disasters was reported in April, where more than 800 migrants lost their lives in a single incident involving a capsized boat off the coast of Libya. The majority of persons lost in this tragedy were from Eritrea, Gambia, the Ivory Coast, Mali, and Sierra Leone. This story is indicative of the larger trend in refugee and migrant deaths in the Mediterranean, with persons from sub-Saharan Africa making up 3/4 of those who have died at sea since 2014. Many of the refugees fleeing the continent are seeking to escape the turmoil that was left in North Africa after the Arab Spring uprising. Our hope, we know that the United States is increasing the number of refugees that we are bringing in, and the Congressional Black Caucus recently wrote a letter to Secretary Kerry requesting that the ceiling for the African region be increased given the scope and duration of the current crisis. And our hope is that this robust increase will expand the U.S.'s capacity to address the current crisis of refugees and migrants from sub-Saharan Africa. As the world pays attention to what is going on in Syria and the tens of thousands of people from Syria who have left their country, recent estimates are 50% of the population has been displaced of the Syrian nation. And so while that has happened, we want to make sure that the United States plays its part, and we also want to make sure that Africa doesn't slip from the news. A year ago, that's all that was being talked about. Today, we hear about Syria, and we do not hear about the refugees that are coming from Africa. I also want to mention Ambassador O'Sullivan, who is the ambassador from the European Union, who is also on our panel. So we look forward to hearing from the comments today from the panelists. I want to welcome you to the African Policy Series, the breakfast series that we have. And once again, we are addressing a very important topic, and not just to have the conversation to go nowhere, but to have the conversation to change policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Representative Bass, for welcoming us here this morning and planning today's discussion on the critical issues concerning the flow of African refugees into Europe across the Mediterranean. As you mentioned, this is the 5th Africa Policy Breakfast, and the topic that we're dealing with today is both timely and critical, and it's particularly important, I think, at this juncture to draw attention to the vast numbers of African refugees who are making this journey because the world's attention is so focused on the Syrian crisis, and understandably so. But it is extremely important that we continue to shine the spotlight on the plight of African refugees. We have a very distinguished panel today of officials and advocates and people who are operational in this field, who are going to help us examine this crisis and discuss the challenges and the opportunities from their own organizational perspectives. And we also will have ample time here today to hear from you, since this audience today represents a very broad cross-section of people who work on the Hill, in the African Diplomatic Corps, development professionals, advocates, and members of the African diaspora, and we very much appreciate your being here. We've asked each panelist to speak for no more than 5 minutes during opening remarks, so that we will have ample time for discussion with you. Let me introduce myself. Sorry. My name is Kathleen Newland. I am the co-founder and now a senior fellow at the Migration Policy Institute here in Washington. It's an independent nonprofit think tank that was set up in 2001. And we deal with a very broad range of issues concerning both U.S. and global immigration and refugee policy. And if those are subjects that you work on and you're not familiar with MPI, please consult our website, migrationpolicy.org, and there is more information there than a normal human being could absorb in a long time. That includes me. So let me take just a few minutes to sort of frame the discussion today, and then I will introduce our panelists and turn to them for their remarks. You're well aware of the enormous inflow of refugees into Europe across the Mediterranean, the Aegean, and those numbers are genuinely overwhelming. Over this last weekend, there were more than 10,000 refugees a day entering Greece alone. And the numbers are now approaching, or perhaps by now, even as we speak, surpassing 700,000. The concern, I think, that perhaps motivates this breakfast is, as I said before, the overwhelming focus on Syrian refugees, and for very good reason, as that country continues to break apart. But I think the concern is that we may see in Europe, not in any sort of official or sanctioned terms, but in practice, a sort of two-tier asylum system emerging. And we see that already just in the routes that refugees and migrants are taking across the Mediterranean. There are two major routes: the central Mediterranean route, moving from Libya, usually, toward Italy, and the eastern Mediterranean route, moving from Turkey toward Greece. Now, just to give you a sense of the dynamism of this situation, last year the central route to Italy was predominant, and I believe there were about 40% of the people traveling were from Syria. This year, the number of people arriving in Italy is down slightly, as Syrians are moving through Turkey to Greece rather than through this much more dangerous route across the central Mediterranean. So this time last year, about 138,000 people had arrived in Italy. This year, it's about 132,000. Greece, on the other hand, has seen more than a 1,000% increase in the number of refugees arriving, from about 50,000 last year to over 500,000 this year. And they are overwhelmingly from the Middle East, from Syria predominantly, but also from Iraq and Afghanistan Those are the sort of big three countries. In Italy, the 4 major countries of origin for refugees arriving in Italy are all sub-Saharan African countries. They are Eritrea, number 1, Nigeria, number 2, Somalia, and Sudan. And Syria comes in only at number 5 and probably dropping in that route. So you see this sort of diversification. And once someone arrives in Europe and claims refugee status, they all go through the same sort of asylum process depending on what country they are in. But I think there is the situations in African countries from which that are generating these refugees and migrants, which we'll hear more about from our panelists, is more complex. Everybody understands Syria is a war zone, almost everyone in Syria is being persecuted or is subject to persecution by someone. But in countries like Nigeria, where you have northeastern Nigeria, effectively a war zone, people fleeing from Boko Haram, but Nigeria is not a country at war. There are, regions of Senegal where religious persecution is rife, but Senegal is not a country at war. So it's a less instinctive, yes, these people are all refugees. And that, I think, is the kind of issue that we would like to get into with our panelists. So without further ado, let me introduce them and say how pleased I am to see them all. And I know Representative Bass shares that sentiment. Our first speaker is going to be Assistant Secretary of State Ann Richard. She is responsible for the Bureau for Population, Refugees, and Migration, and has a long history of both practical and policy experience in humanitarian organizations and in the U.S. government. She will be followed by Ambassador David O'Sullivan, who is the head of the EU, the European Union delegation to the U.S., and Ambassador O'Sullivan has a similarly distinguished career starting in the Irish diplomatic service, but then moving on to the European Union, where he was the first COO of the EU's Foreign Service, what they call their their External Action Service, and has held almost every senior post that an EU civil servant can hold: Secretary General of the European Commission, Chief of Staff to the European Commission President, Director General of Trade, of Education and Training, and I could go on and on. And then our third panelist will be Dr. Tahiti Farah, the President and CEO of the Ethiopian Community Development Council, a venerable organization founded in 1983 as a very small voluntary agency assisting Ethiopian refugees arriving in the United States, which has become one of the only nine national resettlement agencies, and provides a wide variety of services, not only to Ethiopians and other Africans in the United States, but to the whole range of refugees arriving in this country. And Dr. Tefera has been widely recognized for his extraordinary work, not only with ECDC, but in the community more generally. So wonderful panel, very much with extraordinary insights to bring to bear on this subject. So I would like to turn to Assistant Secretary Richard as our first speaker. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you, Kathleen, and thanks to all of you for turning out early this morning, and a special thanks for Congresswoman Bass for organizing this and hosting this event. 2 years ago, there was only the second high-level dialogue on migration and development held at the UN. And the day it happened, that morning, a boat foundered off of Lampedusa, and hundreds of people died. They drowned, and it completely seized the moment of the high-level dialogue. And every speaker at this high-level UN event got up and said, we have to stop this. We have to stop this migration. And most of the people who drowned were Eritreans. And not long after that, I had gone to camps for Eritrean refugees in northern Ethiopia. And they had known the people on the boats. You know, there was very much a connection that even though this had happened miles and miles away, off the coast of they had traveled from Libya to off the coast of Italy, that these were people who were well known. And you know, the cell phone connections and the photos of people who had been in those camps recently. And the thing that struck me about the camps was the strange demographic of how they skewed so young, that these were people who ought to be in school. These were teenagers or youth, as they say internationally, who had walked out of Eritrea to find a better life. And when we talked to them about not risking everything, what came across to me was when you have no hope, no future, this kind of roulette that you play with your life is the only thing that makes sense, because at least you have a chance. Instead of no chance, you have a chance. It's not a great chance, it's not a good chance, it's arduous, and you may die en route, and it's well known to everybody there. But they have that invulnerability of youth, and they also know that there is nothing behind them. And I think that sense that we gotta risk it. We know we may die, but we have to risk it. It infuses the entire migrant and refugee situation across the Mediterranean that we see today. It just infects more people. And it's hard for Americans, I think, to understand. But if you put yourself in their shoes, where you really are quite desperate and your options seem quite bleak, having a chance seems better than no chance. In recent weeks, I was just at the UN General Assembly meetings at the end of September, UNHCR's big annual conference, the Executive Committee. I was at the Global Forum on Migration Development in Istanbul, Turkey. Throughout these meetings, refugee and migration crises in Africa, Europe, and the Middle East were mentioned in almost every discussion. So as I say, this is nothing new, but what's unprecedented is the rapidity and scale of the recent migration movements across the Mediterranean and the Aegean, and the high number of vulnerable persons within these movements. You know, the central Mediterranean route from Libya to Italy is the preferred route for African migrants, and it remains the most deadly. Our bureau, the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, has been engaged in responding to these crises in Africa, in the Middle East, and Europe on a number of fronts. Our strategy has involved providing strong levels of humanitarian assistance to help those caught up in crises throughout the world. So humanitarian assistance in the places to which they've fled, active diplomacy that encourages other countries to respect their international human rights, humanitarian principles, and expanding our refugee resettlement program from 70,000 refugees brought to the U.S. from throughout the world the past 3 years, climbing to 85,000 this year, and likely even higher in fiscal year 2017. Our planning figure is 100,000. Let me mention a few things about resettlement, since Congresswoman Bass brought up the letter. We're calling for much stronger African resettlement. So as part of the U.S. effort to increase resettlement numbers globally, we will be doing more to resettle refugees from Africa. Over the last 4 years, we have doubled the number of African refugees we resettle. I think we'd be doing this anyway because of, you have to take refugees from where they are, but we've been spurred on to do this by the President's National Security Advisor, Susan Rice, who a few years ago was perhaps the first National Security Advisor to take the annual report to Congress in draft form going to the President, and to strike the number out for African refugees and to say to us, we're the Obama administration, we're taking more. So we may not be exactly where you'd like us, but we're headed that way, Congresswoman, because we plan to increase that number still further this year, hoping to get at least 25,000, and then much higher numbers in the following years. We recognize that addressing the various causes of irregular migration from Africa requires increased support for development when we see people, the young especially, moving in search of more opportunity, or because they are expected to find work and send money home, remittances. We also know that development investments can help political reforms that improve respect for human rights and rule of law, when we see people fleeing conflict and persecution. The way we act is we contribute through international organizations, and through them help to strengthen governments to protect and assist refugees and other migrants who are vulnerable. So what do I mean by the vulnerable? We're talking about people who are vulnerable because of their age, their gender, their medical condition, sexual orientation, or identity. To name a few efforts in particular, PRM supports regional migration programs, the Horn of Africa and North Africa, implemented by the International Organization for Migration. Things like designing protocols for officials to identify signs of human trafficking, creating channels for information exchange and coordination among countries of origin, transit, and destination. The Horn of Africa program supports migration response centers along key irregular migration routes. I've already talked about the Eritreans, and so we're supporting UNHCR-run refugee camps in Ethiopia and Sudan, trying to convince the Eritreans of the dangers that wait along the migration routes, but we have to acknowledge that our information campaigns usually do not trump young people's convictions that they will be the ones to make it. And PRM supports UNHCR, and the International Committee of the Red Cross in Libya provides protection, such as checking in on those who have been detained, and material assistance, including food and household items, to vulnerable populations, including the sub-Saharan Africans working in Libya. We're working with European colleagues. We have a US-EU platform for cooperation on migration and refugee issues, which met in March 2015 to explore joint efforts for helping governments in the Horn and North Africa to better manage irregular migration. And we also have had more recent consultations by video conference looking at the current crisis. And let's see, important screening for vulnerable migrants to ensure those in danger of persecution in their home countries are not returned. So I want to end by reiterating our strong position that responding to crossings in the Mediterranean must first and foremost focus on saving lives, ensuring that the human rights of refugees and migrants are respected regardless of their legal status. And I also want to mention that my colleague, Deputy Assistant Secretary Catherine Wiesner, is here with me today, sitting right here in the front row. She, in June, visited the town of Agadez in Niger, a major point of transit for West Africans. It's sort of the funnel through which West Africans seeking to reach Libya and Europe travel, and she's just back from Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, and Kenya, sort of a whirlwind trip. So she also is available to answer any questions you have about our assistance programs in Africa. Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you very much, Anne. We really appreciate that overview and your emphasis not only on what the U.S. does in resettling refugees, but also in addressing the reasons that they are leaving. So I'd like to turn now to Ambassador O'Sullivan for a European perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. I'd like to thank Congresswoman Bass very warmly for this initiative. I think it's extremely important that we keep in mind the global dimension of this refugee and migration crisis, and that, you know, if you'll pardon the expression, that's not just driven by the news cycle. This is a structural problem. It is a tremendous human problem. There's a, you know, at the bottom of all of this lies the human drama that we see, that Anne described in the camps, and we have to keep that in mind. And so the initial focus, of course, is, as Kathleen said, is on Syria, but we have a huge African sub-Saharan dimension to this problem, which we need constantly to bear in mind. And I can assure you that from a European perspective, we're more than conscious of that. At the present time, of course, the situation in Europe is driven in the short term by the fact, as Kathleen said, that our systems of reception for refugees is overwhelmed by the sheer numbers. It's very important to bear in mind that refugees, when they arrive, you don't have the luxury of saying, come back next week when we've been able to find a shelter and accommodation. The moment they turn up on your doorstep, we have international obligations to house, to shelter, to feed people, to give them proper settlement, and to open a file and try to begin to process their claim for asylum, which we do in full conformity with the sort of internationally established criteria for that. And Kathleen, I'm sure you didn't mean it this way, but I really don't think that we will have a two-tier system. All asylum seekers are treated absolutely equally when they arrive in Europe. But it's clear that our systems are under huge strain, and frankly, it's also showing some stresses and strains between our member states, because this is not managed at a European level. We're not a unitary state. We don't have a single policy. We don't have a single border police. We don't have a single organization responsible for asylum processing. So we have 28 democracies, and trying to manage this is a bit complicated. But by the way, I respectfully suggest that even a unitary country facing the same scale of challenge would probably be having some of the similar discussions that we're having in Europe. But what I wanted to emphasize is that in the short term, in terms of the central Mediterranean route, we have reacted, I think, very immediately to the deaths at sea. It's true that something like 3,100 people have lost their lives, tragically, but I want to emphasize that 122,000 people have been rescued. And I think the Italian Navy, the Greeks Navy, and now a European naval force, Triton, is actively engaged in search and rescue. On the other hand, it needs to be understood that this is a very cynical, smuggler-driven situation where people are put in unseaworthy vessels, frequently pushed out to sea. Sometimes the plug is pulled out of the bottom of the boat, and then a phone call is made to the Italian Coast Guard saying, hey, there's a boat about to sink, you'd better come and rescue it. So the other aspect of our naval intervention has been to address the issues of the smuggler's business model, and we have a UN resolution which was agreed with Libya and with the UN African Caucus. We absolutely have to try and diminish the grip of the smugglers on this traffic if we want to save lives at sea, because otherwise it will simply not be possible, and unfortunately lives will continue to be lost. So that's another naval operation that we have put in place. But as Anne has said, and I think it's very important, we always have to look to the origins, and this is a structural problem in sub-Saharan Africa. There are some, we talk about Syria, 11 million displaced people in Syria, 20 million people in the immediate neighborhood of Europe, 60 million people displaced globally. And many of those in Africa. And while we are worried about overwhelming numbers in Europe, many African countries have had to face much, much larger migrations within their countries or from neighboring countries. And we really have to be conscious of this, that the African countries themselves have had to bear a huge burden because of this phenomenon. And it's for that reason that we have been extremely active, both in humanitarian aid, and the European Union and its member states is the largest donor of humanitarian aid globally, and also in Africa, to try and provide immediate relief, but also, as Anne has said, to get the connection between humanitarian aid and development assistance, because we also have to address some of the root causes of why people feel they need to move from their country to have a better life. We just recently hosted with UNHCR the Somalia Refugees Ministerial Pledging Conference in Brussels, and the European Union pledged 60 billion euros. This is 2/3 of the overall 106 million pledge on that day, and we hope that other countries can contribute. We've also set up an emergency trust fund for Africa, which aims to improve stability and address root causes of irregular migration flows in the regions of the Sahel, Lake Chad, the Horn of Africa, and the North of Africa. And it will support those regions to develop better socio-economic opportunities and migration management policies. And this comes on top of the already existing allocation of 4.3 billion euros, which we have made for cooperation with those regions. But this has to be done in close cooperation with our African colleagues. And I think that is for that reason that we have called a summit in Valletta in Malta in 2 weeks' time, on the 11th and 12th of November, with the African Union, the countries of the Rabat and Khartoum processes, representatives of the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, and the United Nations and the International Office on Migration. And the summit will address the challenges and opportunities of migration. It will also recognize that migration is a shared responsibility of countries of origin, transit, and destination. And we need to address those three issues. Discussions will focus on 5 specific areas: addressing the root causes by working to help create peace, stability, and economic development. Secondly, improving work on promoting and organizing legal migration channels, because we have to be conscious that there is going to be migratory pressure, and it will be much better to offer people legal channels to take the pressure off the illegal angle. Enhancing the protection of migrants and asylum seekers, particularly the vulnerable groups. We know that this is a situation which is ripe for exploitation of vulnerable groups. Anne and I were testifying to the Helsinki Commission recently, and I thought Anne was particularly eloquent about those risks and how we also need to be very conscious of that. And finally, an issue which we know will be delicate, but I think we have to talk about, is the working more closely to improve cooperation on return and readmission. When people come to our frontiers, seek asylum, what happens when we decide, under the terms of the international criteria which are there, that these people are not asylum seekers, they are rather economic migrants? How do we discuss the issue of how they are returned back? Because I think unless that is a real reality, then I think the roll of the dice that Anne talked about, of people taking chances, will inevitably lead to further pressure. And frankly, at the end of the day, this is counterproductive. It's not that we don't want to be compassionate, that we don't want to open our doors to as many people as we can, but we know there are limits to what we can absorb in terms of immigration, whether it's asylum seekers or economic migrants. And we need a system that works so that we can have our doors open, provide the compassionate reception, and at the same time demonstrate to our people that when it is decided that people are not genuine asylum seekers, that there is a mechanism whereby they are humanely and correctly returned to their country of origin, because this is a form of illegal immigration which cannot be countenanced on a structural basis. So those are the elements with which we're working, but I want to emphasize we see this very closely, in close partnership with our African colleagues. It's a shared problem. We're willing to put money in, we're willing to put effort, but it needs a joint effort, and I hope that the summit in Valletta will provide that opportunity to take this forward. And once again, I'd like to thank the Congresswoman for this initiative, because the African dimension of this refugee and migrant problem is something we have to constantly keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sullivan, and particularly for talking to us about the upcoming conference between the EU and the African Union and other parties, which signals a real willingness to grasp this problem in a collaborative way. Let me turn now to Dr. Tahiti Farah, who is so closely in touch with the grassroots of refugee populations in this country and their communities of origin in Africa. Dr. Farah, thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. I want to thank the Congresswoman Bass for taking this initiative. It's very important, especially at a time when the international communities and the media's attention is not focused on Africa, but on other refugees. As you know, Africa had the largest refugee population in the world, with over 4 million, and most of these refugees are in Africa itself. That is something that we need to recognize. The African countries, even though many of them are the creators of this refugee situation, but at the same time, they are also hosting refugees from their neighboring countries. If you take Ethiopia, we have a large number of refugees from Somalia, from the Sudan, from Eritrea, and elsewhere. You take Kenya, as poor as it is a host for many refugees from Somalia, Ethiopia, DRC, and so on. So we have to really recognize and give credit, even though the problem is created by these countries, but they are also basically hosting a large number of these refugees. Now, compared to the African refugee numbers, Europe has basically about 1 million refugees. And it is the current attempt, of refugees from the Middle East going to Europe that has basically triggered, this crisis situation. And this crisis situation has always been in the Africa region. We haven't paid attention, we haven't really focused. So I want you to bear that in mind. I also want to thank, the administration, especially Anne, for having the leadership in making sure that the African population, the African refugee numbers have increased during the last 3.5 years. I want to thank Sudan Rice as the national security for having basically taken the responsibility of making sure that we all are focusing on the African refugees. So I want to publicly acknowledge their assistance and their involvement. This year, the number of African refugees to be admitted to the United States is going to be 25. Well, it's better than last year, but is it still enough? Of course, as an advocate, I am going to say that this is not enough. And hopefully, when we deliberate on the refugee admission for 2017, we hope that the African refugees will fare their share in the resettlement process. Now, as I said, I wish and hope we will have a world where there is no need for people to migrate, to flee their respective countries. That is the idealist thinking. But in the real world, that's not going to happen immediately in the short term. So what do we do in the meantime? As you know, most of the refugees that are being hosted in African countries, Africans, we have a number of them that have been there for many, many years. If you look at Kenya, we have a large number of Somalis, Sudanese, Ethiopians from before 1991 that has been sitting there warehoused in refugee camps. So with no hope in the future, they are basically refugees being hosted in these countries with no employment, with no education for their kids. So there is a sense of desperation. They have lost hopes. I think this is a time to address the long-term refugee situations in many of these countries. Otherwise, what happens is when they lose hope, then they are going to seek the unknown. Well, if Kenya doesn't work for me, let me try somewhere else. This is what is happening among the Eritrean refugees, for example, in Ethiopia. As you may know, and you visited the camps in northern Ethiopia, there have been a number of Eritrean refugees sitting there. They don't see any future by sitting. So what happens is they decide to take another journey to the Sudan, from the Sudan to Libya. That's where and then hoping that they would reach Europe. For every successful refugee that has reached Europe, there are a number of people who haven't made it, either going through the Sahara or becoming victims in Libya and in these other North African countries. Look at a number of these Eritreans who have gone from Ethiopia, Sudan, and then Egypt, from Egypt to the Sinai, well, hoping that they will reach Israel. For every refugee that has reached Israel, there are a number of refugees who haven't made it. Either, they have become victims to traffickers, or, if people are not able to pay ransom, then their organs been harvested and sold in the open market. This is a tragedy that most probably we don't hear in the national medias here. Now, I have a couple of solutions. For those people who are in the refugee situation in Africa, maybe we need to do more, either to assist the host countries, either to integrate these refugees if they cannot go back, or in the meantime, as Anne mentioned earlier, either through USAID, the World Bank, the European Union, to increase their development assistance to make sure also that refugees are part of that equation. As you know, many of these countries are poor. They cannot afford even to sustain, economic development for their own nationals. So when the refugee situations are added there, it becomes impossible. So if we can't pay our attention to how do we assist these host countries to include refugees as part of their nationals in the economic development, that may be a solution. In the short time, though, I would urge, whether the Europeans or the US to look at the long-term refugees who have been there. And if nothing can be done, to return them back, then, we have to create a situation where as a one-time intervention to resettle a large number of these people elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tsahai, and I'm particularly grateful to you for your last point of the importance of assisting host countries to include refugees in their economic development planning. And I'd like to take just a few minutes both to allow the panelists to respond to each other if they would like to, and I'd like to put a question myself to sort of kick off our discussion period. And it is sort of taking off from where Dr. Farah left us. And the discussion around the crisis in the Mediterranean has been understandably and correctly focused, as Anne said, on saving lives, on protecting fundamental human rights and making sure that people are not returned to countries where they would be in danger. But if we can just look a little bit over the horizon past the immediate humanitarian demands, which is difficult to do when those demands are at such a high level, I'd like to ask the question of how we can sort of turn the focus to the human potential of these migrants and refugees. If you look at, for example, the African refugee populations in the United States, they are, by and large, after a bit of time has elapsed, extremely successful. And we've done some work at my institute really looking at sort of household income and levels of education and employment and so on, and found that this is a good story. That people really, once they're given opportunities to succeed, do get on their own feet, do make a contribution to their communities and to the country as a whole, and particularly their children go on to be successful and contributing members of the community. So how can we sort of shift that optic? Ambassador O'Sullivan talked about the importance of opening more legal channels for people to move, for refugees, and presumably also highly motivated young people who can't find opportunities in their home countries. At the current moment, they're heading toward just a very small number of countries where they have access to. Germany and Sweden are bearing the overwhelming burden of arrivals, although, as I said, I'd like to turn this from thinking about a burden to thinking about opportunity. And I'd like to ask the panelists what possibilities they see for really opening more legal channels for migrants and refugees, and what kind of international cooperation would be required for that to happen. Would any of you like to take a stab at that? Anne, would you like to begin?
We're big fans of the idea of more legal migration, but it is disappointing that there aren't more mechanisms to make it happen, especially between the countries of Northern Europe, where there's a need for workers, there's a need for population, and sub-Saharan Africa, where there's so many people who want to be there and want to be working. Very interested in the upcoming EU-AU summit in Valletta, Malta. It'll be really, as Ambassador O'Sullivan brought up. I think that is exactly the kind of conversation that should be taking place. But if there isn't an honest appraisal of what's going on, of the factors driving this kind of migration and the needs, will that produce anything? I mean, I think I salute the people who are organizing it, because I think that's exactly the right groups of people to bring together. You know, the one country that was very matter-of-fact about this was Switzerland. And I went to visit them in Bern. They almost fainted, because I guess Americans don't usually leave Geneva. But I took a train ride. It's not that far. It's a very lovely train to Bern. And they explained to me that they had so many Nigerians coming to Switzerland that they had worked out this bilateral relationship with Nigeria, that if they returned Nigerians who had traveled there without legal documents, they would invest in development programs in Nigeria. And so there was this very much a connection. Now, for me, this seems so odd,